Mongol cruelty. One such man was Dmitry of Moscow. When he looked at the Mongols, he didn't see gods. He saw parasites draining his people. And in 1380, on the field of Kulikovo, he made the first move. The battle was brutal and bloody, the Mongols fought with their usual ferocity. But this time, they were met by soldiers who knew their tactics, who had learned patience instead of pride. When the dust cleared, the Russians stood victorious. For the first time in over a century, the Mongols had been beaten in open battle. The legend of their invincibility cracked. Still, the road to freedom was long. The Golden Horde regrouped and struck back with vengeance. Cities burned again, and thousands died. Yet something had changed forever, the fear was gone. Across Europe, the news of Kulikovo spread like wildfire. The Tatar yoke, as they called it, could be broken. The Mongols bled like any other men. Meanwhile, in the west, another force was rising, the Ottoman Empire. Once vassals of the Mongols in name, they were now the true heirs of steppe warfare. But unlike the Mongols, they combined that ferocity with organization, discipline, and faith. The Ottoman sultans studied Mongol tactics but replaced nomadic chaos with imperial order. As the Mongols fragmented, the Ottomans expanded. Ironically, what Genghis Khan began, the domination of Eurasia, would be completed by another power entirely. Back in the steppe, the Golden Horde faced a new enemy from within: greed. Their rulers grew soft, their warriors idle. The once mighty cavalry dissolved into rival clans, each led by a Khan more interested in plunder than conquest. The trade routes that had once made them rich began to wither, replaced by the growing power of European merchants and the rise of gunpowder empires. The bow and horse, once symbols of terror, became relics of a dying age. By the early 1400s, the balance of power had shifted completely. Firearms had entered Europe, changing warfare forever. The Mongols, masters of mobility and archery, found themselves facing walls of iron and thunder. Cannons shattered their charges, muskets tore through their armor. The age of horsemen was fading, and the age of powder had begun. Yet even as their empire crumbled, the Mongols made one last, desperate bid for dominance. In the east, a conqueror rose, a man who dreamed of uniting the steppe once more. His name was Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane. Though not a direct descendant of Genghis, he claimed his legacy. His armies were as ruthless as the Mongols of old, his ambition boundless. He turned Persia to ash, crushed the Delhi Sultanate, and slaughtered the Golden Horde itself in 1395. Europe watched in horror as the specter of Mongol fury returned. But Timur's empire burned too brightly to last. After his death, his realm collapsed almost overnight. His heirs were weak, his subjects rebellious. The Mongol dream of a world empire was finally dead. What remained of their power drifted like sand through the fingers of time. In the forests of Russia, new leaders emerged, men like Ivan III, who would later be called Ivan the Great. They understood that freedom required fire, not prayer. They built fortresses, trained armies, and paid tribute only long enough to grow strong. When the moment came, they struck without mercy. The Battle of Ugra River in 1480 ended without bloodshed, but its silence thundered across the steppe. The Mongols turned back. The Russians stood firm. The Mongol yoke was no more. The empire that once ruled the world had been broken, not by one great war, but by 1,000 small acts of resistance, by time, by greed, by the very nature of man. The Invincible had finally fallen. But the story wasn't over yet. Europe had destroyed the Mongols not only on the battlefield but in the mind. The fear that once froze nations had turned into ambition. The same Europeans who once prayed for deliverance would now set sail across oceans, bringing conquest to other lands. The Mongol legacy of expansion, brutality, and empire would live on, not in the east but in the west. And somewhere, perhaps in the empty steppe where the wind still howls through forgotten graves, the spirit of Genghis Khan would laugh, because in destroying the Mongols, Europe had become them. The wind over the steppe had grown silent. Where once the thunder of hooves shook the earth, there was now only grass swaying under an empty sky. The empire of Genghis Khan had not fallen in a single day, it had withered, eroded, and finally dissolved into memory. But Europe, once broken and bleeding under Mongol fire, had risen from its ashes, stronger and colder than ever before. By the dawn of the 16th century, the story of the Mongols had already become legend. To some, they were the horsemen of the apocalypse, to others, they were the lost empire of forgotten kings. But behind the myths lay a truth Europe understood better than anyone else: power is not only taken, it is learned. And Europe had learned well. The continent that the Mongols once terrified was now unrecognizable. The age of knights and castles had ended. In its place stood kingdoms of iron and flame, driven by invention, greed, and faith. Gunpowder thundered where arrows once flew. Cannons shattered fortresses that had stood for centuries. The Mongols had ruled the world through speed and fear, but Europe had mastered patience and precision. The bow was obsolete, the musket ruled the battlefield. In the east, the remnants of the Golden Horde clung to life. Their khans still demanded tribute from small Russian princes, but those days were numbered. The Russians, hardened by centuries of oppression, had turned the lessons of their tormentors into weapons. They learned to ride, to strike, to endure. They studied Mongol military organization, the tumen, the discipline, the intelligence network, and rebuilt it in their own image. Under Ivan III and later Ivan IV, the Russians began to push outward, reclaiming lands once stolen from them. By the mid-1500s, Moscow had risen as a power the steppe could no longer ignore. The Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and the Crimea, all fragments of the old Golden Horde, stood in its path. Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, carried the memory of Mongol domination like a scar across his soul. He would not rest until every trace of it was erased. His armies marched with iron discipline and cannon fire, storming the strongholds of the Tatar Khans one by one. When Kazan fell in 1552, the Volga River ran red with blood. Ivan ordered cathedrals built on the ruins of Tatar mosques, a message carved in stone: the Mongol age was over. The final blow came not in battle, but in transformation. As the Mongols fractured into smaller khanates, they became merchants, mercenaries, and wanderers. The once proud horsemen of Genghis Khan now sold their swords to survive. Their descendants ruled small cities in name, but their empire was gone. Their culture dissolved into the vast mosaic of Central Asia, overtaken by Islam, Persia, and Russia. Even their language faded from the chronicles of kings. But Europe had not only survived, it had inherited the world the Mongols once sought to dominate. The very roads that Genghis Khan had opened across Asia became arteries of trade for European merchants. The Silk Road, once drenched in Mongol blood, now carried spices, silk, and gunpowder westward. Italian traders in Venice and Genoa grew rich on the commerce that Mongol conquest had made possible. Ironically, the same roads that had brought terror into Europe now brought wealth and empire. The fall of the Mongols also shifted the world's balance of faith. The Christian kingdoms that had trembled before Batu Khan now turned their gaze toward the east with new purpose. The Crusades had failed in the Holy Land, but in their hearts, Europeans had never given up the dream of domination. The memory of Mongol brutality gave birth to a new kind of justification: if the East could invade the West, then the West could do the same in return. The age of exploration began as a counterattack, a centuries-late revenge against the endless horizon of Asia. While European ships cut across the oceans, the last Mongol descendants struggled in isolation. In Crimea, the Khanate clung to Ottoman protection, serving as a borderland between empires. Their riders still raided villages for slaves, but their strength was a shadow of the past. When the Russian armies came for them in the 18th century, there was no glory left, only surrender. The Khan of Crimea bowed to Catherine the Great, and the once mighty heirs of Genghis Khan were swallowed by the Russian Empire. But the Mongol legacy lived on, though not as they intended. Their ideas, of total war, swift communication, and organized control, were reborn in European hands. The Mongols had shown the world that mobility could conquer nations. Europe took that lesson and built navies that conquered continents. The Mongols had ruled through fear and tribute. Europe replaced it with colonies and commerce. The world had turned full circle. Yet history never forgets its ghosts. In the 17th century, as European powers rose higher, some scholars began to study the Mongols not as monsters but as masters of their craft. Chroniclers like Carpini and Rubruk, who had once feared them, were rediscovered. The Mongols' postal system, the Yam, inspired European couriers. Their military intelligence became the foundation for modern espionage. Even their tolerance of religions, something Europe lacked for centuries, was admired by later historians. Europe had destroyed the Mongols, but it had also quietly adopted much of what made them great. Still, the final destruction of their legend would not come through armies or ideas, but through time. The steppe that once roared with conquest grew quiet. The graves of Khans sank into the earth. Their names faded from maps, replaced by the rising nations of the West. Where the Mongol Empire had once stretched from the Pacific to the Danube, new powers emerged: Russia, China, Persia, the Ottomans, all claiming pieces of its corpse. And yet, for all its decay, the Mongol legacy lingered like an echo in Europe's own conquests. When Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic, when English cannons roared in India, when French soldiers marched across Africa, they carried the same ruthless logic the Mongols had once perfected: strike fast, break resistance, rule by fear. The world that Europe built was the world Genghis Khan had dreamed of, a world connected, conquered, and reshaped by power. In destroying their invincible enemy, the Europeans had unknowingly inherited his soul. By the 1800s, the last independent Mongol domains were swallowed by empires. Russia extended its iron grip across Siberia and Central Asia, pushing deep into Mongolia itself. The Qing dynasty of China claimed the rest. The land of the Khans was divided and ruled by foreign powers. The horsemen who once made emperors tremble were now peasants and herders under foreign flags. The empire that had once changed the world had vanished into dust. Yet legends die slowly. Even as the Mongols disappeared from history books, their image endured in European imagination. They became the barbarians of the East, the ultimate symbol of chaos against civilization. Painters, poets, and chroniclers turned their story into myth, a warning about the cost of arrogance, and the thin line between conqueror and conquered. The Mongols had once believed no wall could stop them. Centuries later, Europeans built empires far larger than anything Genghis Khan had imagined. But like the Mongols, they too would one day fall. In the windswept plains of Eurasia, travelers can still find the ruins, fragments of cities burned by Mongol fire, bones buried beneath forgotten battlefields, and ancient mounds said to hide the tombs of Khans. The steppe keeps its secrets. Some say that under those hills lies the body of Genghis himself, untouched by time. Others whisper that his spirit rides still, waiting for the world to forget its fear so he may rise again. But for now, his empire belongs to history. The invincible Mongols were not destroyed in a single war, nor crushed by a single nation. They were undone by the same force that undoes all empires: change. Europe adapted, the Mongols did not. The sword met the gun. The horse met the cannon. The nomad met the nation. And in that clash, the old world ended. From that end came a new beginning. Europe emerged from the shadow of Mongol terror united, hardened, and ambitious. The kingdoms that once begged for mercy now carved empires across the globe. The age of the Mongols gave way to the age of Europe. The torch had passed, not in peace, but in fire. Centuries later, historians would call the Mongols destroyers. But the truth was more complex. They had torn down the old world so that a new one could rise. Their empire connected East and West, blending cultures, trade, and technology in ways the world had never seen. And when they fell, Europe inherited that connection, using it to reshape civilization itself. The Mongols may have failed to conquer Europe, but they changed it forever. The irony is almost poetic. The same continent that trembled before the hooves of Batu Khan would one day draw the borders of nations across the very lands he once ruled. The Russian Empire stretched across Siberia. Britain and France dominated Asia through trade and colonization. Even China, once crushed by Mongol invasion, reclaimed its strength. The cycle of conquest never truly ended, it only changed hands. In the end, the Mongols were not destroyed by Europe's swords, but by Europe's mind. Innovation, gunpowder, and unity, these were the weapons that finally defeated the horsemen of the steppe. The Mongols had conquered the world through fear. Europe conquered it through ambition. And yet, if Genghis Khan could look upon that future, perhaps he would smile. For though his empire was gone, his dream lived on, in the endless hunger of mankind to expand, to rule, to dominate. The Mongols taught the world what was possible. Europe simply finished the lesson. So when we ask, how did Europe finally destroy the invincible Mongols? The answer is not found on the battlefield, but in the centuries that followed. The Mongols' own fire lit the forge of Europe's rise. Their fall was not a defeat, but a transformation, a passing of the storm from east to west. And the wind that once carried the Mongol banners across the horizon now whispers another tale. That no empire, no matter how mighty, can outrun the turning of time.